The investigation into a firebombing of a Melbourne synagogue will intensify today. State and federal police to meet later this morning. Anthony Albanese calling it an act of terror days after the attack. Former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg has penned an open letter.
Well, it's clearly a terrorist attack under the legislation. It's a house of worship, so it's a religiously motivated attack. There were people inside who could have been killed in this firebombing, and it was, of course, designed to intimidate and cause harm. So it is a terrorist attack.
Let's go live to Today Federal Politics reporter Liz Daniels in Canberra. Liz, what will happen today?
Well, David and Sylvia, that classification of terrorism will be the subject of a meeting between Victoria Police and the AFP today, 3 days after the arson attack on the Adas synagogue and a day after the Prime Minister declared he believed this was an act of terrorism. Anthony Albanese had been under pressure to step up his language around the attack from both the opposition and the Israeli Prime Minister. Former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, we heard just then on the show earlier, saying he welcomes the comments from the Prime Minister. We also heard from Independent Senator Jackie Lambie, who believes that the Prime Minister has been too slow to act.
Seriously, it should have taken, if it was a terrorist attack, it shouldn't have taken that long to come out and say, this is a terrorist attack. And to be honest with you, it doesn't matter whether it's a terrorist attack or not. These people doing places of worship, whether they're doing cenotaphs and putting writing all over them, you are truly disgusting, and something needs to be done.
Now, Jewish community leaders are also calling for the Prime Minister to convene a national cabinet meeting to discuss rising anti-Semitism. This morning, all eyes on that meeting of police. David and Sylvia, a terror classification would open up access to more funds for those impacted.
All right, thanks for that, Liz. The Prime Minister has declared the firebombing of a Melbourne synagogue an act of terrorism.
Anthony Albanese announcing millions in new funding to boost security at places of worship after days of pressure. We're joined now by former Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg from Ripponlea in Melbourne. Josh, thanks for your time this morning. First up, you've spent time with that community over the weekend. Understanding what they're going through, understanding what they're processing right now. Just give us a sense of how they are feeling this morning.
They're feeling very saddened that their place of worship has been attacked in this way, this hateful way. And they're also concerned about the safety and the security of the Jewish community across Australia, because this is just the latest in a series of incidents which have involved the Jewish community being attacked, harassed, intimidated, whether it was the riots outside the Sydney Opera House just after the atrocities of October the 7th, to the riots on the streets of Caulfield, to the doxing of Jewish creative artists like Deborah Conway, which has led to death threats, to businesses being boycotted and targeted, to students feeling unsafe on campus. This has been a pattern of conduct which is so un-Australian and which should concern every Australian, Sylvia. So it's time that the government stepped up, not stepped back from the challenges we face, because we're seeing Australian values being undermined every single day.
Yep. We're certainly seeing a rise in anti-Semitism in this country, which is truly frightening too. Josh, you demanded the PM label this a terror attack, which he did do eventually, but some would argue that it should be up to the police investigating the case to declare a terror attack. That's certainly what the Premier of Victoria has said as well. What do you say to that?
Well, it's clearly a terrorist attack under the legislation. It's a house of worship, so it's a religiously motivated attack. There were people inside who could have been killed in this firebombing, and it was, of course, designed to intimidate and cause harm. So it is a terrorist attack, and I welcome that announcement, like I welcome the security funding and the Prime Minister's visit to a local synagogue. But this is all happening after the fact. We've been saying for the last 14 months that the situation in Australia is dire, and we need our leaders to take on this challenge. We need a national police task force designed to combat specifically anti-Semitism. This is not about the other isms and the other forms of hate. What we have seen predominantly across Australia in the last 14 months is the Jewish community being targeted. We need state premiers to restrict demonstrations outside houses of worship, whether it's a mosque, whether it's a temple, whether it's a church or a synagogue. These need to be safe spaces, and they're not right now in Australia. We need a judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on campus, because houses of learning have become hotbeds of hate in Australia, and it's simply not good enough. I mean, just yesterday, across Melbourne and Sydney, we had people chanting "Globalise the Intifada." The Intifada was designed to create, to take losses of life with fire bombings and with suicide bombings, and people are calling for that here in Australia. It's just not on. They're holding up signs saying Zionists are terrorists. A Zionist is somebody who believes in the existence of the State of Israel. John Howard is a Zionist. Julia Gillard is a Zionist. Sir Peter Cosgrove is a Zionist. Are they terrorists? And these people are masked there, concealing their identity. The Prime Minister needs to get serious today. He needs to lead our country forward in a way that unifies people and stops these extremists that are on our streets, in our workplaces and on our campuses.
Just quickly, Josh, because we are almost out of time, Peter Dutton has said that Anthony Albanese's inaction over anti-Semitism has led to acts of violence like what we saw on Friday in Melbourne. Do you think it is fair for the PM to shoulder some of the blame for that act on Friday?
The responsibility rests at the Prime Minister's door. If the Prime Minister, the first among equals in the Parliament of Australia, does not take on this task, what hope do the rest of us have of effecting real change? I believe that the government's weakness has emboldened those who hate and emboldened those who harm. And why I wrote that open letter, Sylvia, to the Prime Minister was I wanted to use my voice to send a wake-up call, a call to action to our government to say enough is enough, not just on behalf of the Jewish community, but on behalf of all Australians who I know are appalled by the firebombing of this synagogue behind me and about 14 months of unacceptable and violent conduct on our streets.
All right, Josh Frydenberg, we'll leave it there. We thank you so much for your time this morning. Well, 2 days after the firebombing of Australia's largest synagogue, and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is declaring it an act of terrorism. Rabbi Gabby joins us now from Melbourne to discuss this. Rabbi, thank you so much for your time. Are you disappointed in the PM's response to this attack?
Oh, frankly, it was quite obvious to all of us in the community what this was when arsonists enter into a synagogue at 4 a.m. in the morning and set it ablaze. That is domestic terrorism. But I understand that the Prime Minister would have wanted to collect all the information at his disposal to make a call. But 48 hours for him to have made that call is quite reasonable. That's what it is, terrorism.
So the government has just announced $32 million to increase security around Jewish places of worship. Do you have an understanding what that might mean for a place like your synagogue, for instance?
Well, for my synagogue, that means security guards, cameras, boulders, and security fencing. And that's where that money will go, towards synagogues, Jewish schools and community centres. So we welcome the $32 million, but what I'm worried about and what the community is worried about is safety right now. I want Jewish students to enjoy their last week of school proudly wearing their uniform without fear of attack. I want families to be able to go to CBDs around the country without fearing anti-Semitic incidences. And I want university students to be able to go on campus proudly as Jews without fearing being harassed or attacked in anti-Semitic ways.
You have a close connection to the targeted synagogue. I know it's not your synagogue, but your grandfather, a Holocaust survivor, he was an early member of the congregation prior to his death in 2016. I just want to ask you personally how your family is feeling in the aftermath of this attack.
We're rocked. It's like living in a horrible, horrific nightmare. My father has been crying for 3 days straight. He can't believe it, that his father, my Zeta, my grandfather, came to this country seeking refuge away from the anti-Semitism of Europe, the wars, the endless wars of the Middle East. And he sought refuge here in Australia and went to this synagogue when he first came here in the 1950s. Towards the end of his life, they would pick him up, the congregation, and take him to go learn at this synagogue. And my father has mentioned many times that he's happy that my grandfather is not here to see his synagogue that he attended set in flames.
What about the rest of the community, Rabbi? How are they feeling? I know there's been a rise, and we've reported it, you've mentioned it as well, in anti-Semitism around the country. But how are they feeling this past weekend, and how are they sort of consoling each other?
The state of shock, ultimately. They still can't believe that their synagogue has been set on fire by just such people with hate in their heart. But they're consoling one another, they're regrouping, and they're just so happy and so just really proud of who they are, that the wider community, just your everyday Australians, have rallied around them, sending message, bringing flowers, just reaching out and consoling them and saying that we are with you, that this hate, this anti-Semitism is un-Australian. It's not accepted here in Australia. And that's where we're finding solace. We're finding solace and comfort in that sense of community that we will bounce back, and also from our neighbours, good, everyday, hard-working Australians that are saying that this is ultimately not on, and we cannot accept this in any capacity. But we need answers. We need to start a national conversation about education in schools against anti-Semitism. It's just an utter disgrace that houses of worship, synagogues, Jewish community centres and schools can be picketed and protested outside of. It's an utter chutzpah. How can we have this here in Australia, that Australian citizens going to their places of worship are being protested against because of a war going on 13,000 kilometres away? It's just frankly not on. And we need action. We need to get around a table, experts, anti-Semitism academics, politicians, Jewish community leaders, to strategize how we are going to stamp out this wretched hate.
Rabbi Garvey, we will leave it there. We thank you so much for your time this morning. SJ.